Today we'll talk about serial killing again. But this show is different because our protagonist wasn't the person who committed the murders. He was behind them though, as the leader of a cult called the Manson family. Some cults, although sometimes regarded by authorities as suspect, go about their days in peace. Others are not so benign. Have you ever seen photos of the Jonestown Massacre? This cult committed the mass suicide of 909 cult members, including 200 children who killed themselves in 1978 by drinking a cocktail of cyanide, Valium, and Kool-Aid. What about Japanese doomsday cult Aum Shinrikyo and its leader Shoko Asahara, who was behind the 1995 sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway that led to 12 people dying? Today, we'll look at one cult only in this episode of the Infographic Show, horrific American cult leader Charles Manson. The word cult comes from the Latin cultus, which means to worship, cultivate, or promote growth. Cult leaders, to some extent, nurture and promote the growth of seedlings, hoping they will grow into flowers, or in some cases, weeds. As you can see in one of the Manson interviews available online, he had a way of nurturing. When I stand up on the mountain and say do it, it gets done. He growls like the maniac he is. He also once said about his flock, "These children that come at you with knives, they are your children. You taught them. I didn't teach them. I just tried to help them stand up." But let's start with some life history and how a child evolved into a wicked man, and later we'll discuss the blood-spotted marks he left on this planet. As Manson recalls in interviews, he was what he calls a street child. That's maybe over the top, but not by much. Mr. Manson came into this world on November 12, 1934, and his full name was Charles Mills Maddox. Prior to that, though, on his birth certificate it read, "No name Maddox." He was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, to Kathleen Maddox, who was just 16 at the time. She was one of America's lost children, leaving home at 15 to try and fend for herself. It's not known why she ran away, but some reports say it was because of her very strict religious upbringing, which, as you know from our other serial killer videos, it isn't always about Christian ethics and church fairs, but sometimes more related to oppressive religious tyranny. Anyhow, the young girl fled her family. Was Kathleen a prostitute, an alcoholic, in and out of jail? Did she once try to sell her unwanted bastard child for beer? Well, this is what Manson writes in the start of his book about his life, called Manson in His Own Words. He writes that his mom was at a restaurant and the waitress made a comment about the cute baby and said she wished she had one of her own, to which Kathleen replied, "A pitcher of beer and he's yours." Charles writes in the book, the waitress set up the beer, mom stuck around long enough to finish it off, and left the place without me. Several days later, my uncle had to search the town for the waitress and take me home. So there you go, another nasty character whose youth was full of woe. It seems his mother was a wretched person, but who knows what background she came from and the trials and tribulations she may have faced in her own youth. Violence begets violence, which could be the epitaph for most serial killers. Manson has said that his mother was no teenage whore, rather she just wanted freedom, just as kids did 30 years later in the 60s. Moving on, Kathleen met a person called William Manson. It seems they married and Charles took the name, but the relationship didn't last long and Kathleen was single again. Charles spent much of his younger years being passed around. When Charlie was 5, his mother tried to rob a guy, but she was arrested after the failed attempt. Charles then went to live with Aunt Glenna and Uncle Bill Thomas, as well as his first cousin, Joanne Thomas. 3 years later, and Kathleen was out of jail. She took back her son, and it seems the two spent years moving around America, often living in cheap motels. Biographies tell us that by this time, young Charles was already a petty criminal, and he wasn't keen on school. So, when he reached 12, his mother sent him to a Catholic school for bad kids. Charles promptly ran away from the school for delinquents. It was a mess, the family, with both son and mom, mirroring their contempt for the law. We can't even list the number of crimes Charles committed when he was young, as there are so many, from stealing cars to running an underground casino. When he was 18, he was caught raping a boy at knife point, and for that, he was sent to Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, Virginia. There, he offended again with 3 offenses related to homosexuality. He got out, got married, had a child. His wife filed for divorce a year later, the same year Charles started pimping out a 16-year-old girl. It seems he had a thing for pimping and making the girls fall in love with him. In spite of that ragged old age look you might have seen, he was quite a good-looking young man, said to be very charming. He married again, this time a prostitute called Leona Candy Stevens. She also soon divorced him, right after he was imprisoned again. Inside, it said he fell in love with 2 things, Scientology and music. He learned to play guitar well and wrote lots of original songs, thinking he might one day become a musician. That dream would not come true. Well, it almost did, but he didn't exactly outshine his beloved The Beatles. Instead, he formed a cult and had people murdered. When released in 1967, he headed to San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury, the mecca of hippie America, where merry pranksters ruled and Tim Leary devoted himself to sermons about LSD. Turn on, tune in, drop out. Manson was pretty good at dropping out already. He dropped out of society and was about to tunnel his way to hell with a string of ardent female followers digging in his slipstream. The first gal to fall for this outlaw was a UC Berkeley librarian called Mary Bruner. She apparently became obsessed with Charming Charlie and then quit her job in a place that years later would be full of books with her name in them. She helped enlist Lynette Fromm into the family, now just a triumvirate, but later this little cult, led by a man playing guitar and making prophecies, would grow into quite the gang. He would, during this time, make a song with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, which only helped him gain more power as a musical guru. More followers would join, and many of them moved to Spahn Ranch in California. It was there he had a third son with Mary. Incidentally, that son, now called Michael Bruner, is currently in a legal fight over Manson's estate. In fact, lots of people are involved in that fight. The only person not to get involved that was close to Charles was the son he had with his prostitute wife, Candy. Reports say Charles Luther isn't interested in the cash. Moving on again, Charles became a spiritual guru by now and was by all accounts convincing. It's said at one point the cult had as many as 100 members. We can't of course get into all those people, but some of them would become murderers. Manson thought the Beatles song Helter Skelter on their White album was about an apocalyptic race war. He once said, "These kids listen to this music and pick up the message. It's subliminal." Manson believed the song was related to the Book of Revelations and the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. The writer of the song, Paul McCartney, later said he just wanted to write a really loud and raucous song, something heavy like what The Who did. Speaking of Manson, he also later said he interpreted the whole thing and arrived at having to go out and kill everyone. It was frightening because you don't write songs for those reasons. Maybe Manson had a point though. Even the sweet-sounding song Rocky Raccoon from that album is all about murder and redemption through the Bible. The Beatles were obviously skeptical of gun-loving, Bible-bashing America though. But the race war didn't happen, so the Manson family had a plan. They would write songs that would subliminally start this war, pitting blacks against whites. According to the University of Virginia, Manson believed tensions would mount and whites would fight against blacks. The blacks would end victorious, and Manson and his gang would then emerge from their hideout in Death Valley and begin to rule over the blacks. It sounds crazy, but they were taking a lot of drugs. Anyway, anyone who has taken a lot of psychedelics knows they have the power to free the mind, help you embrace eternal love, but demons might also get released. It seems Charles had a lot of these demons. But they needed a better way to get Armageddon started, so they thought they would give it a little push. According to one of Manson's main followers, a man called Charles Tex Watson, Manson said they would have to ignite this war and start it themselves. That meant killing white people. Manson ordered his followers to murder everyone at 10050 Cielo Drive, north of Beverly Hills. This became known as the Tate murders. Tex Watson was there, along with 3 women from the Manson family, Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel. The house was the former residence of record producer Terry Melcher, someone Manson did not like as he had rebuffed Manson when he had tried to get a record contract with him. According to reports, Manson had told them to totally destroy everyone as gruesome as you can. Everyone that night was actress Sharon Tate and her 3 friends, a writer, a celebrity hairstylist, and a coffee heiress. An 18-year-old boy was also murdered as he was leaving the house. He was just a friend of the gardener. Tate was 8.5 months pregnant with director Roman Polanski's child. Polanski was in Europe at the time making a film. Time magazine reports that the killings were so brutal they shocked the police. Tate was found tied to another man. Both had been slashed repeatedly, with Tate even missing a breast. Bullet holes covered the house, blood was everywhere. On Tate's extended stomach, where a fetus lay beneath, someone had carved an X into her flesh. As you can imagine, this shocked Hollywood and the world. These were big names, and that was a rich neighborhood. It's even more twisted, as perhaps Polanski's biggest film was Rosemary's Baby, a story about a demonic child released about a year before the murders. So how did the police eventually catch Manson? A group from the Manson family had, prior to the Tate murders, killed Buddhist musician Gary Hinman. They tortured him first for 2 days, Manson himself taking part. One report states Manson sliced and diced what was left of Hinman, badly cutting his ear, a wound that one of the girls sewed up with dental floss. It's not clear what they wanted, but they didn't get it. In the end, they just killed him. Apparently, the girls did the final touch. Some people say that the murder was drug-related, but others disagree. It's a very controversial story, with some people, like writer Truman Capote, saying the only reason the Manson family went on the ensuing murder spree was so police would think the killers were still at large, that in fact, it had nothing to do with Helter Skelter. The reason they wanted police to think that is because a Manson family member, musician Bobby Beausoleil, had been arrested for the murder. He was actually there, but the family wanted cops to think it was someone else. That's one theory anyway. A day after the Tate murders, Manson and members of his family went out looking for more white victims. They found a supermarket executive, Leno LeBianca, who was with his wife, Rosemary. Both were woken up in the middle of the night and then tied up by the intruders. Tex stabbed the man numerous times with a bayonet, and then he or one of the girls used a knife to write war in his stomach. Cult member Patricia Krenwinkel then stuck a fork in his stomach and a steak knife in his neck. After that, the girls all wrote the words, "Death to pigs, rise," and "Helter Skelter" with the man's blood on the wall and refrigerator. Rosemary was stabbed 41 times by Tex and the girls, apparently after Manson had said they all must have a go. Rosemary was obviously dead well before the 41st thrust of the knife. We don't have time to go into all the details, but it wasn't hard for police to connect the murders to the cult. At the time, police said they had arrested members of a mystical, semi-religious hippie drug and murder cult led by a bearded, demonic Mahdi able to dispatch his zombie-like followers. This didn't do much for the so-called scene or the drug LSD, which the government was happy to demonize lest half of America start acting like Hunter S. Thompson and decrying the rat race. On March 29, 1971, Manson and cult members Krenwinkel, Atkins, and Van Houten all received the death penalty. Tex got the same soon after. In 1972, the death penalty was abolished in the state of California, so all the sentences were commuted to life in prison. Manson died from cardiac arrest related to colon cancer on November 19, 2017. He was 83. Other members have died, and some are still in prison. So, did Charles ever feel bad about what happened? Well, he once said this, "Remorse for what? You people have done everything in the world to me. Doesn't that give me equal right?" That doesn't sound like remorse to us. What is a cult? And how does someone know if the faith they are following is harmful? Cults differ from traditional religions as they tend to be closed off from the world and run by a single charismatic leader. In a cult, everything depends on the personal relationship with this leader, and followers are often required to separate themselves from the rest of the world and adhere to strange belief systems and ritualistic behavior. Which cults are the biggest and baddest? That's what we'll be looking at today, in this episode of the Infographic Show, Top 10 Deadliest Cults. In 2012, archaeologists may have discovered the oldest cult when they unearthed objects that shed light on how one was operating in Judah at the time of King David. The archaeological excavation was of the 3,000-year-old fortified city Khirbet Qeiyafa, located about 19 miles southwest of Jerusalem. Researchers uncovered rich assemblages of pottery, stone, and metal tools, and many art and cult objects. The archaeologists also uncovered shrines from the time of the early biblical kings in the Holy Land, providing the earliest evidence of a cult. This suggests that the population of Khirbet Qeiyafa observed two biblical bands of pork and graven images, and thus practiced a different cult than that of the Canaanites or the Philistines, Garfinkel said in a press release issued by the university. The discoveries also offer support for the biblical depiction of King David, he said, but the claims were also met with skepticism by other scientists, and it's not easy trying to verify exactly what was going on 3,000 years ago from digging a hole in the ground. So what about cults of recent times? Well, here's our list of the 10 deadliest ones. Number 10, Hono Hana, or Yorakobi Kazoku no wa. That's quite a mouthful, as well as a very dangerous Japanese cult. The 30,000-member Japanese organization was led by Hogen Fukunaga, who claims he can see someone's past and future by looking at their feet, according to the Japan Times. Presiding Judge Tsutomu Ayagi accused Fukunaga of exploiting people's fears. He used shocking words to fuel their concern, falsely claimed their diseases can be cured through training in his cult, and swindled exorbitant amounts of money from them. the judge said, as he denounced Fukunaga's acts as a vicious crime. Fukunaga extorted $1.3 million from 30 followers by diagnosing them with serious illnesses with his fake foot therapy. Thankfully, this quack was sentenced to 12 years in prison. He should be out by now, but we couldn't find out if he has a new line of work. Number 9. Church of Euthanasia. From spinning records to cult leader, the Church of Euthanasia was founded in 1992 by software developer and DJ Chris Korda. Korda was inspired by Dadaism, an artistic movement that emerged during World War I with a mission to destroy the hoaxes of reason and to discover an unreasoned order. In 1995, Korda created a suicide assistance hotline to help Americans kill themselves. The number was displayed on a billboard along with the message, "Helping you every step of the way." Thousands helped. How about you? The idea was to play callers' pre-recorded instructions on how to end their life. Thankfully, the phone company wouldn't activate the line. During the 1990s, the church even appeared on The Jerry Springer Show. The church still has a website, though it's hard to tell how dangerous the organization is today, and Korda seems to have moved on to 3D printing. Number 8. Order of the Solar Temple. In Geneva in 1984, the Solar Temple was founded by Luc Jouret, a homeopathic physician, and New Age lecturer Joseph de Mombro. The central teaching of the Solar Temple was that the Earth would face some sort of apocalyptic event in the mid-1990s, and to prepare for this event, members believed it was necessary to enter a higher spiritual plane. As part of this process, 53 members of the Solar Temple were murdered or committed suicide in Canada and Switzerland on October 4th and 5th, 1994, and the buildings in which they died were set on fire. The following year, another 16 bodies were found in the French Alps, also buried in a similar ritual. According to the LA Times, each body had at least one bullet wound, and at the crime scene, investigators found vials of toxic drugs and sedatives. Number 7. Rajneesh or Osho cult. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, also known as Osho, began a spiritual movement in 1970, which was an odd mix of capitalism, meditation, and open sexuality. Osho arrived in America from India and set up a commune in Oregon. His followers tried to take over the Waco County government by poisoning the entire town, contaminating salad bars in local restaurants. Over 750 people fell ill and 45 were hospitalized. Though Osho was the supposed spiritual guru behind the cult, the lady in the driver's seat was Ma Anand Sheela, an Indian-born American-Swiss spokesperson of the Rajneesh movement who was eventually convicted of multiple attempted murders. The crazy story was aired on Netflix recently in a 6-part documentary called Wild Wild Country that shocked viewers with tales of poison and paranoia. Number 6. The Children of God. In 1968, David Berg started the Children of God, a cult that was described in an article for The Guardian as devoting themselves to the worship of Jesus Christ and promiscuous sex. Berg announced that female members should have sex with men so as to convert them. He named this practice flirty fishing. In his 1979 annual report, he stated that his FFers, or flirty fishers, had witnessed to over 250,000 souls, loved over 25,000 of them, and won about 19,000 to the Lord. This promiscuous practice was eventually stopped due to AIDS-related concerns. It was religious prostitution, Berg's daughter Deborah said. I had to quit looking at the man as my father, but as the leader of a worldwide movement that was destroying lives. David Berg, who was also known as Moses David, is now living in seclusion, but still communicates to his converts through letter writing. Number 5. The Manson family. Charles Manson is best known for being a serial killer, but when you look at cults online, his name consistently comes up. This is because in 1967, he organized a group of followers under the name the Manson family. Though not exactly a religious cult, the so-called Manson family incorporated ideas from Scientology, Satanism, and various New Age ideologies. Manson preached to his devotees that the United States was on the brink of an apocalyptic race war known as Helter Skelter, named after the Beatles song. On August 1969, Manson ordered his followers to carry out a twin set of killings, including that of film director Roman Polanski's pregnant wife, Sharon Tate, and supermarket executive Leno LaBianca. Manson's followers committed a series of 9 murders at 4 locations in July and August 1969. In 1971, he was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder for the deaths of 7 people. Manson served out his life sentence at California State Prison in Corcoran and died at age 83 in 2017. Number 4. The Fizrahmanist movement. A self-proclaimed prophet had a vision from God. He would build an Islamic caliphate under the Russian city of Kazan. The digging began in the early 2000s, and 70 followers soon moved into an 8-level subterranean labyrinth of cramped cells with no light, heat, or ventilation. It wasn't until 2012 that Russian police discovered the underground Islamic sect. According to British newspaper The Guardian, Fayzrakhman Sadarov, who at the time was 83 years old, had his followers living in a series of dirty, damp cells on 8 different levels underneath a shabby house. Aged between 1 and 17, the children rarely saw the light of day and had never left the property, been to school, or seen a doctor. Sadarov, who declared himself a prophet in contradiction to the principles of Islam, was charged with negligence, said Irina Petrova, a deputy prosecutor in the provincial capital of Kazan. Number 3. The Branch Davidians. In 1981, David Koresh, born Vernon Wayne Howell, went to Waco, Texas to join the Branch Davidians, and by 1990 had become their leader. The 1993 standoff between federal agents and the Branch Davidians outside Waco, Texas is one of the most well-known cult stories, and it dominated news headlines for months. The FBI was attempting to arrest leader David Koresh and so raided the group's 77-acre complex when they began to exchange heavy gunfire at the site. 4 agents with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and 6 Branch Davidians were killed in the firefight. What happened next was one of the most televised cult standoffs in history. For 51 days, Koresh and most of his followers refused to leave the compound. FBI negotiators tried to reason with Koresh, but to no avail. The standoff ended when agents in armored vehicles raided the building, but a fire, which witnesses claim Koresh said himself, broke out and engulfed the complex. Only 9 people inside survived. Critics called what happened at Waco a massacre. The siege left 75 people dead, many of whom were children. Number 2. Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate was an American UFO religious cult based in San Diego, California. It was founded in the early 1970s by Marshall Applewhite, a Texas music teacher, and Bonnie Nettles, a nurse. They met during a stay in a psychiatric institution and renamed themselves Bo and Peep. Heaven's Gate was the first well-known cult of the internet era, using this new technology to share their beliefs and recruit followers online. In March 1997, 39 members, including Applewhite, wearing black tracksuits and sneakers, ate applesauce laced with barbiturates and washed it down with vodka. They then laid down with bags over their heads, wearing purple shrouds. They died believing their bodies would be transported to a UFO traveling in the tail of the Hale-Bopp comet. A strange and dangerous story, Heaven's Gate is still one of the most notorious cults of the 20th century. So where do we go from here? Number 1 is where we go to the People's Temple Agricultural Project, better known as Jonestown, a remote settlement established by the People's Temple, an American cult under the leadership of Reverend Jim Jones in North Guyana. His former followers report that the leader encouraged physical fighting, spying, and the use of fear. At its peak, the temple had connections with many left-wing political figures and boasted 20,000 members, though it's hard to verify the actual numbers. There's a great deal to be said about this cult, but it's without a doubt best known for the events of November 18, 1978, when 918 people died in a mass murder and suicide pact. The mass suicide and killings at Jonestown resulted in the greatest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act prior to the September 11th terrorist attacks. Of the nearly 1,000 church members who began the day in Jonestown, only 33 survived to see the next day. Without a doubt, this makes the People's Temple Agricultural Project the deadliest cult on our list.
It was March 20th, 1995, and Tokyo was bustling with the mundane chaos of the Monday morning rush hour. The Tokyo subway was packed with people headed to work and school. It was so packed that it was easy for 5 strangers to slip into different trains, blending in with the crowd without attracting a single glance. And why would they draw any extra attention? They weren't doing anything suspicious. They were just taking the train, carrying an umbrella, and what appeared to be newspaper bundles. All of the commuters were so preoccupied with their journeys, stresses, and deadlines, they didn't notice each of the strangers dropping their bags onto the floor and then prodding them with the tips of their umbrellas before swiftly exiting their chosen train at the next station. As far as anyone could tell, there was nothing out of the ordinary. But then people started coughing. Some came down with sudden cases of the sniffles. Others were horrified when they wiped their nose only to see blood on their hands. On all 5 trains, passengers doubled over, gasping for air. They vomited onto the floor, collapsed, and began to convulse. Those who rushed to their aid also began to show symptoms. It was as if a sudden viral pandemic had struck the Tokyo subway system, and no one could pinpoint the cause. Chaos and panic erupted across the city, and by the time the crisis was over, 12 people were dead, and thousands were injured. The culprit? Bags of deadly sarin gas, a potent nerve agent, punctured with specially sharpened umbrella tips and left on subway cars to infect as many people as possible. Law enforcement scrambled to determine who was behind the deadly attack, and what they found was even more terrifying than the sarin attack itself. This is the story of Om Shinrikyo, Japan's deadliest doomsday cult. Japan is no stranger to cults. In 1964, the Korean Unification Church, also known as the Moonies, set up shop in Japan and remains active, though less publicly so today. In 1986, Ruho Okawa founded Happy Science, or the Institute for Research in Human Happiness. Its stated aim is to bring happiness to humanity by spreading truth, but many have described it as a cult. But none of those other cults achieved the same notoriety or reputation for bioterrorism as Om Shinrikyo. Every cult needs a leader, and Om Shinrikyo had the charismatic Shoko Asahara. Asahara was born Chizuru Matsumoto on March 2, 1955, to a family of poor tatami mat makers in the Kumamoto prefecture. Infantile glaucoma left him with partial sight in his right eye and no sight in his left, so his family enrolled him in a boarding school for the blind at the age of 6. There, he gained a reputation as a bully, beating up and extorting money from his classmates. After he finished school, he started an acupuncture business and a Chinese medicine shop. But his business suffered a blow in 1981 when he was convicted of practicing pharmacy without a license and selling unregulated drugs. Over the years, he became increasingly fascinated with religion and spirituality and adopted the name Shoko Asahara to go along with his new, more enlightened self. His spiritual practice included a mix of Taoism, astrology, Buddhism, Christianity, and yoga, as well as Hinduism. He borrowed a bit from each practice to form the foundation of what would become Om. Then, in 1987, he did what any enterprising man with a penchant for spirituality and a one-bedroom apartment would do. He started his own religion. Well, it actually began as a yoga and meditation class. It wasn't officially classified as a religious organization until 1989, but by then he had amassed a number of impressive followers, some of the best and brightest Japan had to offer. There were chemists, biologists, doctors, computer programmers, genetic engineers, telecommunications experts, astrophysicists, and more. As the movement began to grow, their outreach tactics evolved. Om members published stories in their own publications and placed ads in others, claiming to have achieved powers of ESP and telepathy during their journey with Asahara and promising to induct others into the secret knowledge that had imbued them with such powers. One member of the organization, Hideo Murai, left his career at Kobe Steel after picking up an Om magazine about yoga and psychic powers. His colleagues noticed his behavior beginning to change and an increase in the frequency at which he brought up the subjects of telepathy and levitation. Finally, he quit his job to devote all of his time and energy to Om. As the organization grew and their beliefs became more extreme, Asahara became obsessed with the biblical prophecies and the notion of a coming apocalypse. He believed that he and Om were the only thing standing between humanity and a dark age that was sure to descend on the earth sometime very soon. Several of the scientists who had become members, including Murai, contributed to Asahara's ideas, suggesting experiments that could study their guru's blood and brainwaves. Others proposed weapons that could bring about the apocalypse, such as laser weapons, nuclear bombs, and chemical and biological weapons. All of these would allow the earth to be wiped clean, so that Asahara and Om could remake it anew. The cult's fixation on weapons extended to weapons that quite probably did not exist in the first place. One example was a supposed plasma cannon that Murai believed America had made and used during the Gulf War to reduce Iraqi soldiers to vapor. This, he claimed, was responsible for the disparity between the amount of Iraqi soldiers found and the amount reported dead. But he assured Om's followers that they'd be safe from the plasma cannon when the time came. Enlightened believers produce an electromagnetic field. When the plasma from the outside affects your body, you can take it as your own energy, and you will be more powerful. Om referenced an Isaac Asimov passage. The empire will vanish and all its good with it. Its accumulated knowledge will decay, and the order it has imposed will vanish. This passage comes from the Foundation Trilogy, a science fiction series that evoked imagery from an apocalyptic disaster that brings ruin to humanity. But amidst that ruin, the Foundation, a secret society turned religion, was the only force capable of remaking the world. Members of Om took misguided inspiration from Asimov's work. Like the Foundation, Om believed that they were in a battle to save humanity. In one speech, Asahara said, "If Om tries hard, we can reduce the victims of Armageddon to a fourth of the world's population. However, at present, my rescue plan is totally delayed. The rate of survivors is getting smaller and smaller." Attempts to recruit more members escalated and were referred to as the Om Salvation Plan. New recruits were promised cures for their ailments, help achieving their dreams and goals, and self-improvement as long as they were willing to devote themselves to the work, whatever that might mean. So what exactly did that mean? As the cult's ideology grew more extreme, so did its practices. This was no longer just about yoga, meditation, and an austere lifestyle. Members were expected to put their very bodies on the line. In one case, cult doctor Ikuru Hayashi dosed Asahara's personal bodyguard with an undisclosed liquid. The man became dizzy and fainted. When he woke up, he was lying on a bed, disoriented, his head covered in swollen, painful patches. These spots, 4 in total, were surgical incisions made in the man's skull. Later, he would recount, "I think they might have put electrodes in my head." Asahara was obsessed with the human brain and all the ways one could control it. The group was said to employ hallucinogens, shock therapy, and electrode caps, all to manipulate brainwaves and control the human mind. In one case, electric shocks were used in an attempt to wipe the short-term memories of followers who were suspected of being disloyal. These were administered in the form of 100-volt shocks delivered to the top of the scalp. Over 3 months from October to December 1994, one Om doctor named Hayashi administered over 600 electric shocks to 130 followers. Many of them reported that their memories were so scrambled after that they could not remember the name of the cult, the name of their guru, or sometimes even their own names. Members chosen to receive these shocks included suspected spies, members who tried to escape, or members accused of being involved in sexual activity which was strictly prohibited under the rules of the cult. At the height of its popularity, Om had its roots in nearly every corner of Japanese society. These were members in the ministries of education, justice, transport. There were judges, employers at Toshiba, Hitachi, and IBM, and even members of the military. Even members of the police force had ties to Om. As the membership swelled, the cult had more resources than it ever had before, and the money it received was tax-free too, since it was classified as a religious group. Asahara and his favorite members put that money to use, funding their research, recruitment, and attempts to silence voices of dissent. In the early 90s, the cult began a campaign of wiretapping against those who vocally opposed them. But spying wasn't enough. Om put together an assassination list, naming well-known opponents of the cult as potential targets, including cartoonist Yoshinori Kobayashi and the heads of Soka Gakkai and the Institute for Research in Human Happiness. Most of these targets were never actually harmed, but one unfortunate opponent of the cult was not so lucky. In October 1989, 33-year-old lawyer Tsutsumi Sakamoto was working on a class action lawsuit against Om Shinrikyo. Unbeknownst to Sakamoto, Tokyo Broadcast System Television, who had interviewed him on the subject, showed several cult members a tape of the conversation. This was a violation of journalistic ethics, but the consequences would be much worse than a simple breach of conduct. On November 3, 1989, several members of Om Shinrikyo, including Hideo Murai, Satoru Hashimoto, a martial arts master, Tomomasa Nakagawa, and Kazuaki Okazaki traveled to Yokohama, where Sakamoto and his family lived. They brought 14 hypodermic needles and potassium chloride with them. Originally, they intended to kidnap Sakamoto from the train station, but they didn't account for one thing. It was a holiday that day, so he stayed home. But they didn't abandon the mission of revenge there. At 3 a.m. on November 5th, they entered the Sakamoto family apartment through an unlocked door. What happened next was nothing short of horrific. We can't be exactly sure what happened, but this much is clear. Tsutsumi Sakamoto was bludgeoned in the head with a hammer, injected with potassium chloride, and strangled. His wife, Satoko Sakamoto, was beaten and also injected with potassium chloride. Finally, their infant son, 14-month-old Tatsuhiko Sakamoto, was injected with potassium chloride and killed. All 3 bodies were placed into metal drums and hidden in Niigata, Toyama, and Nagano. The cult took care to cover their tracks even beyond disposing of the bodies in 3 different prefectures. They also burned the bed sheets, dropped their murder weapons into the ocean, and smashed the victims' teeth to make them more difficult to identify. The bodies were not found, nor was the case linked to Om Shinrikyo until 6 years later, after the Tokyo sarin attack. So how did the sarin attack come about? Well, as Om began to prepare for Armageddon, the group became increasingly interested in various weapons of mass destruction. One of these was sarin, a nerve gas popular with the Nazis during World War II. They also experimented with mustard gas, anthrax, and botulism. They didn't stop at chemical and biological weapons either, and also worked to produce a stockpile of machine guns and explosives, all of which would be used to survive the apocalypse and seize control of the ruined planet in the aftermath. Prior to the infamous Tokyo subway attack, the group dipped their toes into the public use of bioweapons that they had worked to cultivate. First, they attempted to spread anthrax on the morning of July 1, 1993, from a cooling tower on the roof of their Tokyo headquarters. Throughout the following day, 118 complaints were lodged by local residents regarding a foul smell. Other residents reported a gelatin-like oily gray to black fluid collecting on the side of the building. Environmental officials collected this fluid for later testing, and it was revealed to be an attempt to aerosolize a liquid suspension of anthrax, triggering an epidemic. But aside from creating a public nuisance and a bit of discomfort, the operation was a failure. Next, there was the first sarin attack, the opening act to the horror show that was the attack in Tokyo. This was not meant to be a random mass murder, but rather a targeted assassination of 3 judges involved in a lawsuit against the cult. It would also serve as a test run for the sarin that the group had synthesized, allowing them to gauge just how deadly it would be. An area in the city of Matsumoto, Nagano Prefecture, was selected for the attack due to the presence of the judges, as well as the personal grudge that Shoko Asahara had toward the city. Residents there had opposed Asahara's plans to open an office and a factory there and had created an anti-Ohm petition that amassed 140,000 signatures. Originally, the plan was to attack the courthouse. However, after the cult discovered that the courthouse was closed, the target changed to the apartment building where the city's judges lived. On the night of June 27, 1994, members of Ohm released a cloud of sarin from a refrigerator truck that had been especially outfitted with a heating unit, which turned 12 liters of liquid sarin into a deadly aerosol. Once the gas had been created, fans inside of the truck dispersed it, sending it into the air around the apartment building and the neighborhood. By 11:30 p.m., less than an hour after the gas was released, paramedics were overwhelmed with patients. People were experiencing eye pain, loss of vision, nausea, diarrhea, and numbness in their hands. Some saw a literal fog float past their homes, bringing with it a foul smell and the sudden onset of the symptoms. Concerned and unsure of what else to do, the paramedics informed the Matsumoto police of the unfolding crisis. 274 people were treated at the nearest hospital, and 2 died immediately after being admitted. 5 more victims were discovered dead in their apartments, where they'd succumbed to the effects of sarin before they could call for help. Humans were not the only casualties in the area. A pond near the scene of the attack was filled with dead fish floating belly up. The bodies of dogs, birds, and even caterpillars were found in a 150-meter radius of the pond. A forensics analysis identified the mysterious poison as sarin, but no one knew who had released it. The authorities were dumbfounded and at first suspected the husband of one of the hospitalized victims, a man named Yoshiyuki Kono, who was storing a large amount of pesticide in his home. It was later revealed that the pesticide he possessed could not have been used to manufacture sarin, but only after the media ran with the story and Kono was nicknamed the Poison Gas Man. He would not be officially exonerated until sarin gas became nearly synonymous with Ohm Shinrikyo. And this brings us back to the day of the Tokyo subway attack. Asahara was feeling the pressure as the Japanese police became increasingly suspicious of the cult. They were planning to raid Ohm Shinrikyo buildings. Asahara believed that this left Ohm no choice but to strike first. They would attack in a central area, one where a number of police were likely to be injured or killed. 5 men were chosen from the best and brightest minds in the cult. The group of selected terrorists included 4 vice ministers of Ohm Science and Technology Ministry and 1 doctor. There was Dr. Ikuyo Hayashi, who had already seen his fair share of human suffering during his time at Ohm, but though he had misgivings about the planned attack, he felt he could not refuse. There was Yasuo Hayashi, who had been involved in Ohm since 1988 and took part in wiretapping and kidnapping on behalf of his guru. The third group member was Kenichi Hirose, an applied physics graduate who abandoned a career at an electronics firm to dedicate himself to the cult. Masato Yokoyama was also a physicist who had quit his job and joined the cult with the intent of saving mankind. The last man chosen to carry out the attack was Toru Toyota, who had previously been a physics graduate student at Tokyo University before another student recruited him to Ohm. Each man was assigned a different train and a different station, with each train's route eventually leading to Kasumi Gaseki. The attack went just as planned. The men ruptured their bags of sarin and exited their respective trains, jumping onto their waiting getaway cars and leaving the passengers to suffer the horrors that followed. The attack was like nothing Japan had ever seen before or since. All at once, people were collapsing and falling desperately ill for seemingly no reason at all. Pandemonium broke out on each train while the media struggled to get a complete picture of the breaking story. One train after another was halted, and evacuation orders were made over the intercom, urging people to get to safety. People screamed, vomited, foamed at the mouth, and hospitals filled with patients all suffering from the same inexplicable symptoms. One unfortunate woman had to have her eyes surgically removed after the nerve gas caused her contact lenses to become permanently fused to her eyeballs. All the while, the trains kept on running. One of the cars made its route 3 times before it was identified as one of the sources of the sudden outbreak. Even the victims themselves spread the poison without knowing it, carrying traces of sarin on their clothes and shoes, infecting anyone who came too close in an attempt to assist them. As the fog finally began to clear, literally, the police began to investigate. The similarities between this attack and the one in Matsumoto were apparent, and the authorities focused their attention on a group that had already been raising red flags, Om Shinrikyo. Only 2 days after the deadly attack, the police raided the Om offices in Tokyo, as well as the laboratory headquarters at Kamikuishiki. There they found stockpiles of weapons as well as chemicals needed to produce a large quantity of sarin. Subsequent raids were conducted, and in May, Shoko Asahara was arrested alongside 200 members of the cult. At first, Asahara denied that he or any Om had any involvement in the subway attack. However, many of his followers admitted that Om was responsible for the Tokyo attack, as well as the Matsumoto attack. They also confessed to a failed train attack on March 15th and the murders of several opponents of the cult. 13 of the arrested cult members were sentenced to death, and after an 8-year trial, Asahara was sentenced to death in 2004. 3 members of the cult managed to evade justice for over a decade after the attack before finally being arrested. Hirata Makoto, who surrendered in 2011, Kikuchi Naoko was arrested in 2012, and Takahashi Katsuya, Asahara's former bodyguard, was also arrested in 2012. For his role in Om's crimes and for being suspected as acting as a getaway driver during the Tokyo attack, Takahashi was sentenced to life in prison. In 2018, Asahara, along with 6 of his followers, including the scientists who helped manufacture the sarin, were executed by hanging. Family members of those killed in the Tokyo attack, such as Kiyoe Iwata, shared their feelings on finally seeing Asahara's reign of terror come to an end. Iwata told Japanese broadcaster NHK, "This gave me peace of mind. I have always been wondering why it had to be my daughter and why she had to be killed. Now I can pay a visit to her grave and tell her of this." Shizue Takahashi, whose husband was killed in the attack while working as a subway deputy station manager, issued this statement: "I wanted the others to talk more about what they did as lessons for anti-terrorism measures in this country. I wanted the authorities and experts to learn more from them. I regret that is no longer possible." And that was the end of Om Shinrikyo. Well, sort of. There were still active members of Om in the aftermath of the Tokyo attack, and while many members left the group behind after the raids and subsequent arrests, others remained. In 2000, the leadership of Om, or what was left of it, released a statement regarding the group's involvement in the Tokyo attack and other attacks of terrorism and murder. In the statement, they apologized for the impact of the attacks. As a board member of the former religious organization, I thought it is my responsibility to make an apology and to explain what we are going to do about the incidents. Since December 1st of 2000, when we apologized in public for the Om Shinrikyo-related incidents, we have continued looking into the incidents very carefully. As our present organization consists of those who were not directly involved in the incidents, our understanding of the incidents varies from person to person. However, as it became possible for us to directly contact a number of high-profile leaders of the former organization who are still in police custody, we have advanced in fact-finding processes and have become able to evaluate the incidents. In the meantime, the involvement in the incidents of former Om Shinrikyo followers became evident through trials and confessions by the accused ex-followers. Consequently, steering members of the present organization who are board members, Chorobu, and the section leaders have unanimously agreed that the former Om Shinrikyo leader, Shoko Asahara, had been involved in the incidents, though they refrained from concluding his criminal liability because he is still being tried in the court. We could say that former Om Shinrikyo founder Shoko Asahara was a kind of genius in meditation, but at the same time we cannot approve of the incidents his organization caused. While inheriting the superior practices of yoga and Buddhism and the meditation method his yoga talent has left, we'd like to clearly disapprove of the incidents. We once again deeply apologize to the victims and bereaved families in the incidents. As ones who once belonged to the same religious organization, we deeply feel responsible for the outcome of the incidents. Considering what we have done in the past, I believe we have to reform the organization drastically. They also changed the name and the structure of the organization, stating, "We will change our name from Om Shinrikyo to Aleph." After the reform had been completed, I, the acting representative, will take responsibility for the organization as a representative. This means former Representative Shoko Asahara will no longer represent the organization. The new organization will not have a guru, and the position of founder Asahara will be confined to the subject of meditation. Since he will be regarded only as a spiritual being, he will not be in a position to give orders to his followers. We define Lord Shiva and Buddhas as the fundamental subjects of our adoration. In our context, a guru means an interpreter of the scriptures. There have been a lot of gurus in the past, and we do not define a guru as the unique and absolute being. Aleph is still alive today, as is its splinter group, Hikari no Wa, or the Circle of Light. Shoko Asahara and Om did not get what they wanted. They did not usher in an apocalypse that allowed them to reinvent the world in their image and lead humanity. We can all be thankful for that, but it is undeniable that they made an impact, one that changed the face of terrorism on a global scale. Even as time marches on and they fade into the shadows of history, Om Shinrikyo serves as a somber reminder of just how dark, twisted, and dangerous a belief can become if left to fester unchecked. It's early in the morning when the sound of his beeper awakens a Fall River detective. It's a body, he's told, a murder. What he doesn't know is that the crime scene he's about to see will strike fear into the hearts of all Americans. There are Satanists among us, people will hear from their TVs. No one is safe. The victim was named Doreen Ann Levesque. Abandoned from a young age, she had the worst kind of childhood and later found herself doing sex for work. She was brutally murdered on October 13, 1979. Her body was found under the bleachers at the Diamond Vocational High School. The two joggers that made the grisly discovery could hardly believe their eyes. She'd been tied up and viciously beaten, her face barely recognizable as the girl she'd been. Notably, to some, the murder had a ritual element to it. It wouldn't be long until people started to whisper the word Satanist, but as you'll see, people can get carried away, especially when they've grown up hearing dark tales about the devil. As city names go, Fall River sounds pretty, but to be frank, this wasn't a pretty place back then. Once a fairly prosperous textile town, Fall River in the late 70s and 80s had fallen on hard times. That was evident when you walked down some of the streets and witnessed the many drunks, the drug addicts, and prostitutes trying to eke out a living in some very harsh conditions. Levesque was one of the many young girls who'd ended up on the wrong part of town. On some nights, there were so many prostitutes and prospective Johns that it caused traffic jams. Still, while the place was run down somewhat, the murder shocked everyone, the sheer brutality of it. The next victim was 19-year-old Barbara Raposa. She was reported missing in November, but her body wasn't found until January 26, 1980. Like the first victim, she'd been bound and hit over the head and the face with a heavy object. Also, like the first victim, she'd been a victim herself of the travails of a difficult life. Like Levesque, she was known to frequent bars in some of the rougher parts of town, and she was said to have a drug habit. To make ends meet, she also got involved with sex work. So there were two young female victims. Both had been brutally killed after being tied up. These murders, it seemed, were not crimes of passion. The modus operandi in the killings pointed towards a possible serial killer. It also looked as though Levesque's body had been moved in a specific way, something that the police called posing. This sometimes happens in an attempt to hide something from police or because the act of posing gratifies the killer. But cops at the time were looking for perhaps something bigger than a lone serial killer. They had reason to believe Satanists were in their midst. They'd heard rumors about such people. On February 8, 1980, the same police were talking to a 20-year-old sex worker named Karen Marsden. It goes without saying that in a small city such as Fall River, if you worked on the streets, then you knew the other sex workers. Marsden was with cops that evening in a state of terror. She was rambling and at times making no sense, although she seemed to suggest that she knew something about the satanic rituals that had been going on, usually out in a place called Freetown State Forest. Police asked her who headed this murderous cult, but the only name she'd give them was Satan. She didn't actually mean Satan himself, but some evil person who'd been given the name Satan. She told cops that if she actually told them who this Satan person was, she'd be dead in no time. She refused to believe that the authorities could protect her. Marsden then told the police to drop her off at St. Mary's Church. She was so shaken up, she said she wanted to talk to a priest. The next day, she was reported missing by her grandmother. She wasn't seen again, alive at least. A couple of months later, her skull, with some teeth attached as well as clumps of her hair, was found in a nearby forest. Her body was nowhere to be seen. Now we'll introduce you to another important person in this story. She is Robin Marie Murphy, who was 17 when police started talking to her. Murphy was yet again another victim in the story, a girl who had suffered at the hands of men since she was just young. This trauma led her to a life of darkness, and at some point she ended up working as a pimp on the mean streets of Fall River. It's there that she got to know the murder victims. Like the other folks in the tale, she can often be found around the housing projects in the city called Harbor Terrace. On any given night there, you could score a gram of whatever, hear the screams and arguments of drunks, and watch the sex workers head toward their place of choice, Bedford Street. Strangely, the hub of criminal activity was just around the corner from police headquarters, but the cops didn't seem to interrupt the various transactions that took place there on a nightly basis. They did, however, often visit their informants. One of them became Murphy. Murphy, according to those who knew her back then, was a fearsome character. She might have been smaller in size than many of the male hoodlums, but she was said to have little fear of them. One of the males she might have had reason to fear was a pimp and a so-called competitor. His name was Carl Drew, and he was 26 years old when this was all going on. Now we have all but one of the main pieces in place. We can tell you how the cops began to solve the crimes. Well, how they thought they solved the crimes. You'll soon agree that they could have gotten many things wrong. So there were two pimps on the streets, one man and another a woman. Police believed that Drew ruled the streets for the most part. They said he was one mean man, and he led his territory by putting the fear of God in people. Well, we should say the fear of Satan, because cops believed that he was this Satan character. They often thought that Drew used satanic rituals to scare people. That body found under the bleachers was his work, and the reason he could get away with it was his control over people. The police believed that it was Drew who killed Marsden too, because she had known about his earlier murder. One story had it that Levesque was killed because she wouldn't work for Drew. It didn't help Drew's case, a man that couldn't read or write and had a hard-knock life himself, that Murphy said he was indeed Satan and the leader of the rituals. She also said that Marsden had told her that she'd been forced to watch Drew kill Levesque. Marsden and Murphy had certainly been close. It seems they become lovers at one point, and so if anyone knew Marsden's closest secrets, it would have been her. Murphy agreed to testify against Drew. She told detectives that he'd killed Marsden because of the threat she was going to talk to the cops. She said Drew often had satanic rituals out in the forest where he sacrificed animals on an altar in the name of Satan. Murphy said on the night that Marsden was killed, Drew had forced her to cut her throat, after which they decapitated Marsden and even played around with her head. This sounded utterly crazy, which among other things created what is called a satanic panic. All over the US at the time, there was talk about satanic ritual abuse. These so-called followers of Satan did terrible things to their victims to propitiate their devil leader. The very talk of such rituals sent shockwaves through the US. But let's remember, such talk also sold newspapers and had people glued to their TV screens. The witch hunts, you should recall, were also keenly followed a few hundred years earlier in Europe. There were 8 churches in Fall River, so talk about God and the devil and the destruction the latter wreaks on mankind was not out of the ordinary. Strange beliefs even today are held in what's called the US's Bible Belt, so buying into stories of satanic rituals was not too strange back in the 1980s. What's of importance here, though, is out of all the thousands of rumors of satanic ritualism happening, there's never been much proof they actually happened, if any proof at all. Much of the panic started because of a book called Michelle Remembers. The book featured a woman who, through hypnotism, could recall moments in her life which Satanists had ritually abused her. That book has now been widely discredited. A satanic cult murdering people in Fall River got a lot of airtime, and many people believed the stories, but besides the words of a few people, there was absolutely no evidence they happened. Still, the newspapers back then wrote that Drew was accused of threatening his girls with satanic violence if they ever got out of hand. Prosecutors explained to the court that Drew had told people that he was the son of Satan. The court heard that Murphy had been possessed by Drew when she committed those terribly violent acts. The prosecutor asked her, "And what did you do?" Murphy answered, "Cut her throat." She also said that Drew had cut off one of Marsden's fingers and taken a ring from it. Another young woman testified that one night Drew had given it to her in a bar. It didn't help his case that when Murphy was testifying, she wore a cross around her neck. The prosecution had done a good job at pitting the devil against a God-fearing victim. So when Murphy said Drew carved an X into the victim's body, the court almost shook with fear. When she said that Drew had spoken in an unknown language when doing the sacrifice, the palpable fear almost had people wanting to run out of the door. Murphy said he'd often speak in his foreign tongue when conducting other rituals that didn't involve murder. She said she'd attended around 10 of them from October 1979 to February 1980. The killing of Doreen Levesque was an offering of the soul of Satan, and so was the killing of Miss Marston, she told the court. We should state something very important here. There was no physical evidence whatsoever that put Drew at any of those crime scenes. Nothing. Zilch. He was a man that couldn't read or write, that later said he thought the justice system could never send an innocent man to prison. And guess what? Murphy had been lying, and we mean telling very tall tales indeed. She later said that she'd been coerced by prosecutors into fingering Drew for the crime. As for the satanic stuff, she said she'd also been pushed to talk about that. She'd been told she'd get no more than 12 years for a second-degree murder conviction, which, as you'll see, didn't happen. She later said she did believe that Drew had committed the first murder. She didn't know it for a fact, but she was convinced enough to let him go down for the other murder. As we said, she was a victim herself. She'd suffered at the hands of a man named Andy Malte, someone who had committed heinous crimes against young women in the area. We won't go into details, but he was a pervert to the extreme, a wicked man if there ever was one. During the murder investigations, he'd been talking to cops, apparently trying to offer some help. Here was a man with a history of violence against young women, a man who was known to keep tools in his car to commit such violence, and he was trying to help the police. He told the police that he thought he knew what happened to the last victim, Miss Raposa. He said he'd had a vision in a dream in which he saw her being killed. Here is some of the transcript when he was interviewed by the police. Police. What was in his hand? A knife, a gun? Malte. Two hands in the air, something holding in between. Police. Knife or a gun? Malte. From what I could see, it looked like a rock. Police later took him to the scene of the crime, and Malte knew exactly where the body had been found and which direction it had been pointed in. He even told the police, I sense a murder weapon here. It might have been a piece of concrete. He was right about that. He knew too much. Police didn't think that Malte had some kind of psychic ability, and instead, they charged him with the murder. Murphy later testified in court again, this time saying she'd actually been with Malte at the time of the murder. Years later, she admitted to making that up too as retribution for the things he'd done to her. To recap, Murphy said she took part in one murder and then later said she totally lied about that. She'd also said she'd been with Malte on the night of another murder, but she'd lied about that too. At least one other victim would later come forward and say Malte had done horrible things to her, but she'd been ignored by local police when she made the complaint. We now have another man in prison serving time for the Marston murder. Drew was convicted of that and sentenced to life without parole. While police tried to say he killed her because she could talk about the Levesque murder, Drew was never convicted of that crime for lack of evidence. The connection was still used against him though. Not too long ago, some documentary filmmakers started investigating this dark tale. They looked into that ring that Drew had apparently given to the woman after taking it from Marsden's hands. The woman told the documentary makers that there had been no ring, that she'd made that story up. The reason, she said, was cops threatened her with prison for another crime if she didn't testify to that story. If this couldn't get more confusing, another woman said she was there for the Marston murder, and she said it didn't take place in the forest. She said she saw Murphy committing the murder on a rooftop. The documentary maker said this in an interview. You could literally just go into the Fall River Superior Court and read the trial transcripts, 11 volumes. No one that reads these trial transcripts will come away thinking Carl Drew was guilty, despite what the jury said. In fact, hardly anyone who has studied the case with new eyes thinks that Drew had anything to do with the murders. He might have been a violent and unethical man, a trafficker of vulnerable young women, but that doesn't mean he should be serving that long sentence if he's innocent of the murders. Some people think that it was Malte who was likely behind all the murders. He was certainly a sexual deviant, and the more you know about him, you could be convinced he was capable of serial killing. He died in prison many years ago, so no one can speak to him again. He once told the police, "Once I worshipped Satan, but now I worship Jesus." We doubt he ever really worshipped anyone. He was a ruthless criminal, and there is nothing especially occult about hurting young people. It seems beyond doubt that no crimes in Fall River back then took place because of any belief in Satan. There's enough evil in the story to fill a book, but no devil pulled the strings. There are a lot of victims, but it seems there's no overarching dark power involved except all the jagged pieces that fit into place to condemn some people to a life of misery. One of those victims could be Drew, who might well be the victim of the justice system. He later said, "I was thrown into the middle of a mass nightmare that involved macabre accusations of devil worship and human sacrifice, totally off-the-wall accusations that were right out of some thriller novel. None true as far as I was involved, and nothing like that was being said." As you watch this, the Massachusetts Innocence Program is still trying to get him a new trial, but since his appeals have been exhausted, it might mean some new evidence needs to come to light if he's ever to get out of prison. Murphy had been released on parole after her second-degree murder charge based on the lies she told, but she didn't adhere to the conditions of her parole and was sent back to prison. Now she'll have a new hearing.
In order for cults to be successful, they have to be good at enticing followers. Not only must they be able to recruit new members, but they must also be able to maintain their allegiance. Typically, conversion involves someone who is vulnerable. That is, someone who has recently lost a friend or a loved one, failed an important exam, or otherwise feels helpless, depressed, or alone. For a vulnerable person, joining a cult can be very tempting, as it often comes with some promise of reward, companionship, peace of mind, a place to stay, and more. Of course, it also helps if the cult has a leader who is charismatic and adept at the art of persuasion. Given the appeal, how can one possibly ever hope to talk a member into leaving? How do you deprogram a cult member? Back in the 70s, deprogramming involved drastic measures to be taken. That is, the cult member would be physically kidnapped and dragged away from the cult. It was an expensive service, costing upwards of tens of thousands of dollars. So not just anyone could ask to have a friend or family member stripped apart from a cult. After being forcefully removed against their will, the cult member would undergo hours of intense debriefing, in which psychological techniques were utilized as an attempt to counter the brainwashing that had been done to the individual while in the cult. These psychological techniques involved educating the cult member, asking critical questions in order to encourage the person to think in an independent way, and trying to provoke an emotional reaction in the person that would help him reconnect with his former life. This part was done by introducing objects from the person's past and having family members share memories of pre-cult life. In essence, you could say it was conducted like an intervention of sorts. Today, we understand that it's highly unethical to kidnap people against their will, so this method of deprogramming is no longer utilized. Though it may be tempting to want to pull out someone forcefully and hit them with a stroke of reality and a taste of the outside world, this method simply isn't the answer. As the old saying goes, 2 wrongs don't make a right, and so it can be tough to convince someone that their cult conducts unethical practices when you yourself just acted unethically by kidnapping the guy to begin with. The act of kidnapping alone also has the potential to cause a certain level of post-traumatic stress that could be greater than whatever events occurred in the cult, which is obviously counterproductive. In this way, the whole operation could do more harm than good, and the person may decide they want to return to the cult for the sake of seeking refuge. Congratulations, your deprogramming session served to reaffirm the person's desire to stay in their cult by helping them realize the danger of the outside world. So then you might be wondering how else deprogramming can be done. Well, with any change, we know that it's far better to allow people to come to their own conclusions and make the choice for themselves to seek help rather than act on force. Though it may be frustrating to accept, you simply can't control the actions and cognitions of others. From your perspective, you may see a loved one make an obvious mistake, but unless they come to terms with that mistake themselves, there's really nothing you can do, and trying to intervene has a risk of fueling resentment and causing a rift in your relationship. In a way, it's like watching a horror film when the lead character turns a corner blissfully unaware that the killer is right there. You shout at the TV screen yelling, "Don't go in there!" As the viewer, you know what's in store, but you have to sit there and watch the character face the threat anyway. That's when you might hide under your blanket, shielding yourself from the anticipated moment. This you do because you just can't bring yourself to watch. So is there anything that can be done for cult members, or is it entirely out of your hands, like watching a character make the wrong choice in a horror film? Thankfully, you're not completely out of options. Kidnapping and imprisonment may be out of favor nowadays, but there is another method that most families turn to. This method is known as exit counseling. Exit counseling focuses on using psychological techniques towards steering the cult member to submit to a debriefing session voluntarily. The job of an exit counselor is to guide the family of a cult member by introducing them to effective communication strategies. Family members are told not to be judgmental and to remain calm and loving. Otherwise, they'll only drive away the cult member, reinforcing the idea that the outsiders are not to be trusted. The family is taught how to convince the person to consider debriefing in a gentle, non-forceful way. Exit counseling is successful if the cult member agrees to participate in the process. If not, the family must come to terms with the reality of the situation. When a cult member agrees to undergo the process, the psychological debriefing techniques that are used are the same as they were in the 70s. That is, they involve long hours of intensive sessions. Unlike the debriefing process of the past, however, the cult member is free to leave at any time. As we mentioned before, you can't force any person into a specific course of action. For this reason, there's no guarantee that exit counseling and cult removal will work. About 1/3 of deprogrammings tend to fail, and the statistics on the success rate of exit counseling are not definitive. When it does work, former cult members find themselves returned to the outside world, but not without a whole new set of problems. Some people who leave cults can go on with their life after a short adjustment period, while others may struggle for a longer duration. It depends on the level of psychological damage, the type of the cult, and how long the person was in the cult. Those who leave a totalist or destructive cult could experience severe depression or anxiety and have trouble making decisions for themselves once released into the external world. This is because a totalist cult tends to exploit its members' vulnerability as a manipulation tactic to exercise complete control. To do this, some unethical psychological techniques are used, such as through reform, which basically brainwashes individuals. Another kind of cult, known as the non-destructive religion type, uses a different manipulation strategy. These cults attempt to alleviate the feeling of vulnerability by offering spiritual guidance in order to exercise control over the members. While some may move on fairly quickly in post-cult life, others can go through something known as floating, in which the former cult member shifts back and forth between the cult and non-cult ways of thinking and viewing the world. Sometimes they can experience flashbacks. There are also many other psychological and emotional difficulties that former cult members may endure. Some may experience regret for leaving because they now feel meaningless in the outside world, unable to hold on to a job or handle money. The cult may have provided the person with a sense of purpose and community that's now lost to them, and they might not be able to rejoin for one reason or another. Others may feel guilt and shame from past actions, knowing that they've been brainwashed into recruiting new members and collecting money in illegitimate ways. They may also feel guilty for past treatment of friends and family members, or resentment over their cult leaders who may have had them commit crimes or acts of violence against others for some presumed purpose. It may also be difficult for former members to accept their past actions and forgive themselves. Then there's the fear of retribution. If a former member was a part of a particularly violent cult with a leader who threatened the lives of defectors, that person may live with a constant sense of paranoia. In this case, the ex-member may fear chance street meetings with cult members and the very real danger that would accompany this. There are many other situations too which may complicate post-cult life in the outside world, such as if the former member has family still in the cult. Some may have left behind spouses or children, and any attempt at making contact is too risky. If a person was raised in a cult or spent most of their life there, they may lack an understanding of the outside world that would allow them to function normally. The list of problems is practically never-ending, which can increase the difficulty for people wanting to rejoin life outside the cult. Overall, the consensus amongst psychologists for the best way to aid a former cult member with reintegration into society is to provide them with an abundance of family and social support. Be as loving and understanding as you can, and importantly, you must exercise patience. Understand that former cult members may be overwhelmed and terrified, questioning their decision to leave and feeling extremely insecure and fearful. All you can do is be sensitive to this and let the person know that you're willing to listen to their concerns.
The term cult refers to a social group defined by its religious, spiritual, or philosophical beliefs, or its common interest in a particular personality, object, or goal. Religions tend to follow beliefs that are published openly in books such as the Bible, Quran, or Bhagavad Gita, whereas a cult relies on secret knowledge revealed only to members by the cult's founder and leader. In a cult, everything depends on a personal relationship between the founder and his or her followers, who are required to separate themselves from the rest of the world, often being bound to prophecies with a dark apocalyptic ending. That's what we'll investigate today in this episode of the infographic show, What Really Happened in Waco, Texas. April this year marked the 25th anniversary of one of the strangest and most tragic incidents in American religious history, when a bloody siege ended between FBI agents and members of the Branch Davidian religious group in Waco, Texas. The siege had dragged on for 51 days, and during that time, the FBI negotiators had continued to seek an agreement with sect leader David Koresh. 33-year-old Koresh, born Vernon Wayne Howell, came from a dysfunctional family background. Koresh told the FBI during the late-night negotiation chats that he was a lonely child teased by other kids who called him Vernie. But to himself and to his followers in the Branch Davidian sect, Koresh was the almighty Lamb of God, commanding men to surrender their wives to him, fathering babies with girls as young as 12, and preparing his followers for the imminent apocalypse. While Koresh was the leader of the cult, the story of the Davidians begins several decades before his ascent to leadership. The group, also known as Shepherd's Rod, is an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists, a Christian religious group that today boasts roughly 19 million members worldwide. Unlike regular Christians, though, they believe that the Messiah prophesied in the biblical book of Isaiah was not Jesus, but was yet to come, as was the apocalypse. After 51 days, the FBI's negotiations had hit a wall, with Koresh responding with everything from cracking jokes to threatening to start World War III, and much of it delivered using the scriptures, in particular the Book of Revelation. On the morning of Monday, April 19, 1993, with the FBI team still divided about whether negotiation could succeed, they eventually gave in and decided force was the best way to end the siege. Several hours were spent firing military-grade tear gas into the building before FBI armored vehicles moved in. Things took a turn for the worse just after noon, when the main building was engulfed in flames. Strong winds saw the fire spread fast, and the flames destroyed the biblically named Mount Carmel Center, part of the Davidians' compound. Byron Sage, head of the FBI negotiating team in Waco, called over the loudspeaker system, "You know, David, don't do this to those people. This is not the way to end this." But on that fateful day, 76 Davidians, including Koresh, died. More than 20 of them were children, some killed by smoke inhalation and others by falling debris as the fire destroyed the building. Only 9 sect members emerged alive. There have always been questions around those last few hours at Waco. Did the FBI and the Justice Department contribute in some way to that apocalyptic ending by applying too much pressure onto the Davidians, or were they somehow responsible for causing the fire? Independent filmmaker Michael McNulty found a shell casing from a certain type of tear gas round that could have started a fire. That evidence pointed towards the FBI potentially being responsible. The Justice Department had denied using this type of tear gas for more than 6 years, but after pressure from Johnston, who, for several weeks, wrote to his superiors warning them that the new evidence contradicted what they had been saying, Attorney General Janet Reno eventually admitted that the tear gas round had been used. So the FBI was caught in a lie. Though credible experts still overwhelmingly believe the Davidians started the fire, the admission breathed life into conspiracy theories that surround the Waco case. Who actually caused the fire has remained a point of contention, although an independent arson investigation concluded the fire was started from within the building. Another area of contention is who fired the first bullet. Gunfire broke out on the compound when agents arrived with arrest and search warrants. There was evidence that the Davidians were illegally stockpiling weapons. In fact, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms believed the community had nearly 250 weapons, including semi-automatic rifles, assault rifles, shotguns, revolvers, pistols, and hundreds of grenades. So could the gunfire have started on the inside? Amid the chaos, Koresh called 911 to report the shooting, but a transcript of the call remains inconclusive as to who exactly started firing first. Eyewitness reports are often the best way to find out what really happened. ABC News ran an article earlier this year with statements by some of the 9 survivors of the 1993 tragedy. The tank came into the front doors, the 2 double doors, and they just blew everything back. It was amazing to see a tank come through your living room, said Waco survivor and former Branch Davidian member David Thibodeau, who was inside the compound when the agents stormed the place. Those inside say the tanks destroyed the interior staircases, trapping many on the second floor. Thibodeau says he barely escaped. The wall started to catch fire, and I could feel the heat. It singed the side of my face. I could hear my hair crackle. Former Davidian David Bunz said Koresh wouldn't let his own children go, as he believed he was the next Messiah, and so his children were special and born from the message of God. Bunz also believed Koresh had started it on purpose to be in control of the situation, but Clive Doyle, another Davidian inside during the siege, said he wasn't sure. "I didn't see where it started, or who lit it or didn't light it, whether it was an accident, whether it was deliberate. There were no gas masks for the children, so the parents were soaking towels in buckets of water." One thing's for certain, Waco was a tragedy that no one would want to see repeated. Are you familiar with other apocalyptic cults out there? What do you think drives someone to join a cult in the first place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video called Most Horrific American Serial Killers. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time!